I'm Amy Cates. I'm joining you here from Manhattan in New York City. Greg will be joining me from his home up in Connecticut in the US, and I see that we have quite a global group on the call today. Really thank you for ODC, for ODF, EODF. It's a wonderful partnership to really bring together all of the groups that are involved in professional organization design, and for us to be able to have the opportunity to bring you a topic that Greg and I have been working on very much over the last year or so. The name of this webinar is Designing Global Organizations for Agility and Scale, but we might as well be calling it, how to be big and how to be fast. And really what we're going to talk to you about today. So I see lots of familiar names, clients, colleagues, folks we've worked with, and excited to have you in. And as part of this, many of you already discovered the chat box. Please, along the way, send questions, comments that you have. We'll try to address as many as we can, follow up, and what we'll do. And as I note there, the webinar is being recorded by ODC, and a link will go out to everyone who registered, and will be on the website as well for those who are on. So before I jump into things, just let me test that Greg is on and we can hear him. Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Excellent. Good, good. Greg has been traveling, I think just arrived from Seattle on his way to Mexico City, so very glad that we could both be doing this at this time. So let me just cover what we're going to go over today before I do turn it over to Greg to take us through the first piece today. Our topics are these. One is really to talk about how do you match the operating model to the strategy. You'll see we'll make this distinction between an organizational strategy and then something in between strategy and organizational model, which we call the operating model, which is the assumptions that a leadership team has about how the pieces of the organization fit together. We have really found that alignment on this is essential then to creating organizational models that make sense and really link to the strategy. We'll be sharing that idea with you. We'll be talking specifically about then some different organizational model and structural combinations that we have found given different sort of strategic archetypes that work for different, to create both this notion of agility and scale. And then finally, one of our favorite topics, as you know, is how do you build the right lateral integrators to knit these complex organizations together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Greg. And Greg, I'll run the slides, so you just let me know when you want to go forward.
Good, okay. Well, we're going to talk about this whole idea of getting started by thinking about the operating model of the company in those businesses that seek to be global and to achieve the benefits of both agility and scale. So if we look at this first slide, this is just a quick bit of history about the path to global organization that many companies have taken. Amy and I discovered this trend. I don't think there's anything terribly new about it, but we were sort of struck with the idea that companies had really progressed through a number of phases or waves. We think of wave one, for example, as the start point for companies that are really local for local. They develop international organizational models over time as their offshore business expands, and they allow that international division to manage that business. But there is a wave two that inevitably occurs where the international organization gives way to global business units, and the company is then structured accordingly in a matrix normally where you have global products, services, or brands that are aligned from the center, and then commercial channel management sitting out in these various regions of the globe. What's happened in a kind of wave three, particularly we've watched it happen multiple times with a number of companies over the last several years, is that then there is this sort of point in time when it appears that the global model has run its course, and there are experiments then moving the pendulum back to a more locally driven or locally oriented approach to managing the business. Sometimes then there is yet another shift. So we see this sort of back and forth as the nature of events with a lot of companies, particularly I would say, since the recession of 2008. We think there's a better way, and partially it means recognizing a trend that this next page demonstrates, where there have been two very important shifts we think that have occurred since that recession. One is that companies discovered weaknesses in their strategies and, in fact, their business models that have led to very different approaches to both. In many cases, reflected in consumer-oriented companies by much more of an omni-channel approach to marketing and go-to-market through e-commerce. In both B2C and B2B companies, much more of a solutions-oriented approach to managing the offering, where standard components and services are bundled by commercial regions, or realigning product creation and innovation more around platforms rather than separate products. Because often, while there are differences in the region, in the nature of the end customer solution, they should be able to work at least with common components and platforms. So this has been a very definite, much more aggressive approach to innovation over the last 7 or 8 years. Obviously, setting up new business incubation teams, groups are another example of this change in strategy. Vertical integration in the case of a number of companies, wholesale companies like a Nike that now become retail as well as wholesale businesses would be examples of that, but there are many in other industries. The second impact here really has been then incorporating digital technology into all facets of the business, which also enables some of these new strategies and these new business models, obviously. But it also creates challenges. This includes using digital in the way we go to market, in the way we engage customers, establishing e-commerce capability, clearly something that we didn't necessarily expect in a PepsiCo or other companies that work through traditional trade partners, but now also have direct-to-consumer business volumes that are increasingly growing. Digital product creation is another one of the examples of digital incorporated into legacy parts of the business. And then there's the whole running of the company, the supply chain, and other elements of the business that have been enabled with new forms of digital technology and artificial intelligence. These two drivers, we think, have really led to this interest in taking a look at the operating model of the company, because some of these changes are so fundamental that it sort of forces us to think differently about what is the role of a business unit versus what is the role of a function, and what is the role of the commercial teams and the channel management people who may sit out in the regions. Often it means shifting the power balance, creating a different center of gravity that is more center-led or less center-led. And it also includes new faces and players in the organizational model in many cases. Digital, again, being a really good example of that. So it really means thinking differently about this notion of trying to create a model that does establish local relevance, local responsiveness, think of that as agility, and at the same time, developing parts of the organizational model that really are focused on scale, leverage, benefit from consolidation, reduced cost, and really leveraging fewer, bigger ideas in the innovation process. In this model, global and local must coexist. We definitely have to find more effective ways to work horizontally across all the boundaries, across functions, across businesses, and across regions. So that leads us then to what we might think of as sort of the fourth wave as we go back to this kind of historic view of this work and say, in this future state, rather than swinging the pendulum back and forth, let's design a model that really does deliver the goods on both agile as well as the scale benefits of more center-led. We see this happening in people drawing much more from the assets and capabilities of the company as a whole, rather than designating the center as the direction-setting body for this sort of governance model. Let's think more about moving work to where the capabilities exist. We don't have to have it all sitting in the center. We can scale regional operations that have unique capabilities that should be serving the enterprise as a whole, and where the center plays much more of that orchestrating or linking kind of role in that overall process. We use a model, and we've used it for years, to try to think about the nature of the operating model. This is a very high-level view, certainly not the entire story, but we often do find it's a helpful way to start the conversation, where we will ask senior executives and the CEO of the company to think about this sort of 4-point spectrum of operating model types. On the left side, you have the fully integrated single business companies that really are run more or less as an operating team. And then on the far right of the model, the extreme variation to holding company or the true conglomerate. The distinguishing feature centrally in this model is, to what extent do we seek integration and synergies across businesses, across regions, across functions, in order to deliver on this different strategy or perhaps different business model that we are now driving. And it's a conscious choice when it works well. Most companies actually land somewhere in column 2 or 3, where there is a much more nuanced conversation about, to what extent do I really need much more harmonized process, a much more linked or single kind of agenda or strategy that threads through my product divisions or my customer segments, which would be true in column 2, versus column 3, where I really empower those businesses to act more autonomously. I create a much more vertical structure for businesses. And while there are points of integration, especially through functional agendas and common process, I would really seek much less in the way of active collaboration in innovating new products, for example, across those divisions. So, conscious choice, no right answer. In fact, we notice here P&G is in column 2 and Unilever is in column 3, and they are in the exact same businesses. It is truly a potential choice for the CEO and team to make that says, what is that model that works best for us?
So Greg just spoke to how sort of operating model choices, how you think about the relationship of the parts of the business and the geographies and the functions have organizational implications. And so your next question is likely to be, well, then what are my options and how do I match structure then to those operating model choices that we've made? Well, of course, in org design, there is no recipe. However, there are a set of patterns that I want to share with you. And once you start to see these patterns, you'll become a better diagnostician and you'll become a better designer and have more options too for yourself. So we're going to focus here on those middle 2 columns that Greg talked about, the closely related and loosely related portfolios in global companies. That's where these patterns are most complex. If you have a single business, and even if it's big and global, it's fairly simple. Your operators are, you run the company, and often it's just a very simple function to geography matrix. Clearly, the holding company is also a relatively simple structure at the enterprise level. It's really when you try to make more of the sum of the parts in the middle that you have to make these tough choices around where do we connect and where do we leave autonomy. So well, let's spend a few minutes on talking about what are our choices and what are those patterns around structure and operating model. So as noticed in the comments in the chat, Dan Schmitz asked the question, what's your working definition of agility? So let's talk about that right now, agility versus leverage, which is one of the core tensions at the center of every design choice as the organization grows and becomes more complex. If we can think about it in 2 different ways, agility in 2 different ways. One on the left is about being local, being autonomous, being separate. This allows us to focus on customers, regions, product lines. Typically, what we see is then a very vertical approach to business units. CEOs, boards, general managers love this kind of notion because it creates clear accountability for P&Ls. Match my authority with my accountability, give me my P&L, give me my resources. And the benefits here are really we can adapt to market variations, business unit speed, general manager accountability. So each one of those units that's in either that loosely or closely related portfolio can focus on its market niche and really win. We get work when CEOs then come to us and say, hey, that's all very good, except we have duplication of resources all over. We have a lot of P&L complexity. We have a lot of costs that we're carrying and not really getting the return on our assets, whether they're talent, whether they're capital assets, whether they're knowledge or best practices. How do we move them across? So the other kind of agility that we can think about, which is a little bit different, is enterprise agility. And this is thinking more globally around scaled, integrated. And as Greg mentioned, the push that we see today around fewer, bigger bets in innovation, more direction, not control necessarily, but direction from the center, so that we can really make use of the global reach and network and share resources and services where it makes sense. And this kind of agility is really important. This is where you see organizations really adapt to new enterprise priorities, enterprise speed portfolio shifts, harmonization, consolidation to create the pathways for knowledge and talent to move across boundaries. And that's the ideal, right? That is the story that is sold when we want to create more center-led. What we don't want, though, is centralized without thoughtfulness, which leads to the classic problems of bureaucracy, decision slowness, distance from the customer, less accountability, and frustration. So the key in these closely and loosely related portfolios is finding the right places where we should be local, autonomous, and separate, because doing something together or leveraging isn't adding value to our customer or to the business, but also being very conscious and being deliberate around where we need to be global, scaled, integrated, all on the same page in order to make use of those assets. And as org designers, then this becomes our challenge to help our client with. So the first pattern is to start to see this and look at it. The second pattern is then to look at the fact that the structural building blocks of global organizations are quite similar across industries and around the globe. Greg already mentioned the global business units, global functions, regional commercial units. We have a couple of different models here of two different companies that have illustrated this and used it in their internal kind of explanations to their own employees, how they're put together. John Deere there, you see the regions, the different product lines there on the right, and strategic marketing solutions and enablers as those functions that tie them together, supply chain and such. PepsiCo imagines it as a kind of cube in which you have the functions on one side, the three lines of business, beverages, snacks, and nutrition, emerging products, and then they're very strong regional groups on the third side of the cube. And of course, the key is then how do we wire together? If you look inside that cube, what are those connections there, and how do they work together? We use the concept of an organizational model to show the relationship of the components. And we're very specific about this rather than trying to go to an organization chart. So here's a very typical generic model underlying many global, closely related 3- and 4-dimensional organizations. And it helps to address many of the issues and trade-offs facing companies today. And honestly, we see variations of this over and over. And building on the work of Jay Galbraith, we call it the front-back model. So if you think about a company that, again, is trying to be both fast and big, typically on the front end, you'll see consolidation around customers. So you'll have your geographic and your customer structural building blocks in the front end, both delivering to customers and bringing the voice of the customer market back into the business. And you're organizing this front end to reflect market segments, regional differences, key accounts. If we go to the back end, there's also a different kind of consolidation here around scale and size, often around technology, shared platforms, R&D, supply chain, operations. And the idea here is to push innovation and manage work for efficiency, commonality, scale, leverage across the product lines. What are the best technology, new solutions to bring into the work? And the middle then brings all of this together to set really differentiated strategies around either those product categories or brands. Because if you remember, in that closely related and loosely related portfolios, we do have different products, categories, and brands that may have different customer sets or different technologies, and certainly unique competitors. So PepsiCo as a company really doesn't compete against anyone. Their salty snack division competes against other pretzel and chip companies. Beverage competes against other soda, coffee, water, juice companies, nutrition against other granola bars or other snacking companies. So there needs to be specific strategies in there, but what makes PepsiCo successful is its ability to leverage relationships out in the market on a regional and local basis, and then also to leverage incredible R&D capabilities on the back end. So we like this model. It's a great place to start thinking about, to add and subtract, connect the pieces differently, strip away parts to understand, hey, what decisions have been made in the past, and where do we want to adjust for the future? So let's look at 3 different variations of this. The first one is what we would call a differentiated middle with a shared back and front. So if you think about Microsoft as an example here, you might think of it as a very loosely related set of businesses: Windows, Office, Xbox, LinkedIn, Surface, they're even in the equipment business. But actually they're quite closely related and strongly connected in the front and the back. And they have 2 big ideas here. One is infrastructure as a service, which is cloud, the Azure business, and software as a service, which all of their products are becoming as essentially software products. So you've got cloud in the back, you've got sales and services in the front, all about getting customers onto the system, not necessarily just about selling products. And so this is a big change for Microsoft. They've been going through a lot for the last 5 years. And what used to be quite a loosely related portfolio is now becoming a much more closely related portfolio as it's all built off this platform of cloud. So this looks like very much like our sort of core model there. A second one is we're seeing in many companies, but across the many medical device companies that we've been working with over the last 5 years. And what you see here these are companies in which they are selling into a common customer, but the back end has very, very differentiated technologies. And so in this case, you see more of the strength of the fully loaded business unit, which we know is the best driver of innovation. So let's look at this one. If you see those product lines across bottom there, devices, hardware, robotics, really need their own engineering, supply chain, operations, product marketing. These are hardware businesses with a lot of technology built in. Many of these companies, though, also supply the disposables and supplies that go along with these devices. And of course, that's a completely different engineering, supply chain, operations, and marketing business. And what many of the customers are asking for and requiring these companies to provide are software and services to then mesh all of these devices into existing platforms that are in the hospital. And so we have different groups there. So in this case, the middle and the back actually have to be linked horizontally and look more like a little mini business unit and quite differentiated, because sharing the back doesn't give you a whole lot of benefit. But what has to be shared is the front, because market access and delivery in medical device, just as in pharma, has changed quite a bit over the last few years around the world, in which you have big key accounts, hospital buyers, procurement organizations, government buyers, in which you have very complex sales and marketing functions that need to be managed as a whole and then differentiated within. The third pattern that you can start to see would be essentially the opposite of that. And here we use 3M, but you could look at W.L. Gore and other kinds of companies like that, in which have a very strong shared platform of technology that they are leveraging across a wide variety of business segments and customer groups. So here the markets are quite different. So each sector really needs to have its own marketing and sales, because some may be B2B, some may be B2C. In this case, in a 3M, where you have R&D, technology, and manufacturing organized geographically and managed very strongly from the center, your business groups are quite different, healthcare versus safety and industrial. And so each one of those needs a differentiated business development, marketing, sales, and operations. So when we start to look at the organization this way, it gives us a way to talk to business leaders around different ways of thinking about the organizational model, grouping work, linking, separating as some of those first decisions in order to really link to operating model to strategy. And then from here, we can have a very clear pathway to do the detailed design that we need to. So in sum, a quick thought guide on this. Consolidate or scale gives you an advantage, either cost, expertise, global reach, platforms, technology investments. Differentiate, where being local gives advantage around product innovation, customer knowledge, go-to-market, or other types of relevance. And then the logic can be applied as you design each component. So even when you get down into your enabling functions or marketing or supply chain, you can start to think about where to consolidate and where to be local. So remember, start with the organizational model, not the org chart, and not with the leadership team, because for any of these models that we've shown, many different leadership team structures can support the same org model. So now let me turn it back to Greg, and let's look at the third piece is, how do we start to build in the right lateral integrators to link across the inevitable boundaries that we create regardless of how we put the model together. Oh, Greg, you're on mute.
Very good. So what we've largely talked about then is designing structures that allow us to establish a different operating model that is aligned with a new business model or strategy. But we all know that org structure is only one part of the design process. And so this idea then of really finding fresh ways to build in much more horizontal organization has reached, I would say, even a greater level of importance than it has in the past. We're going to look at two examples of ways that companies are using these horizontal integrators today in what we think is sort of fresh and novel approach. In doing that, though, let me set up a framework that we use a lot to try to distinguish and ask the leadership to distinguish between horizontal work or center-led work that tends to be more or less centralized versus that which has much more of a center-led quality aimed at integration. And this model's been around for a while. We used it years ago in the first book that we did together, where we asked people to think about distinguishing integration on the vertical axis of this 4-box from control. The idea being that we need to change the conversation, try to get away from debating the pros and cons of centralized versus decentralized, which gets confounded with issues of control versus empowerment. When we interview executives in a lot of companies, they will say to us, oh, we're a very centralized organization. When they say that, after you dig down under the layers, you find out what they're really saying is we have a lot of controls. Our finance function requires 15 signatures on every CapEx request and the like. That is not integration. So we've tried to distinguish here and argue our objective is to actually move to higher degrees of center-led capability, which may or may not require high degrees of control. In the ideal, we can empower teams, we can empower business units, but do that inside a center-led framework that actually increases our ability to delegate, because now we have the leadership aligned around a single strategy. We use common processes to get key work done. We have a clear sense of decision guardrails. These frameworks allow us to actually be faster, more agile, allow us to delegate more to teams, but inside a much more center-led overall direction and framework. Okay, with that idea in mind, let's look at these two examples. The first is, we think there are some really creative things going on with networks today. Not necessarily a new idea. What is new is that companies are making these networks a very explicit and formal part of their operating model, where groups can come together and then be dissolved based on the nature of the challenges. Here we have an example actually of an apparel company whose idea is generated around a designer jean, profile, fabric, and so forth that originates in China. The people in the center had very little to do with the idea itself, but the strategy work that the center led caused China to identify this opportunity. The center then plays a role in connecting that innovation to other regions, in this case, Western Europe, who take portions of that same profile with a different fabric, a lot of the same ideas incorporated into innovation programs that are launched in Western Europe. And then eventually, the center plays a role in moving some of those ideas back to the United States. It's an illustration of work moves to where the capability sits. Ideas can come from anywhere. You get a much stronger sense of ownership on the part of the regions as to whether or not this idea suits their market, what they would be prepared to invest. The center continues to influence by getting everyone in that extended team aligned around the same, in this case, brand strategy. And so there is a definite orchestrating influence leadership role from the center. But the capabilities in this case are sitting in the regions, and they are networking them together in a manner that serves the cause of the greater enterprise. PepsiCo uses this exact framework in the way that it develops snack products, where it has distinct centers of expertise around salty snacks that sit in one part of the globe, other centers of expertise in another, and they really do rely on this sort of bargaining process for the distributed brand teams to be able to come together around fewer, bigger bets. The second idea that we want to talk about a little bit that's also related to networks is one that is peculiar to our experience in working with companies that have really built extensive digital capability over the last several years. Here's an example from a company that has a very specific set of strategies that focus digital assets around brand building, e-commerce, digital product development, and digital technology, a sort of separate technical backbone that serves the, let's call it, more commercial elements of digital, to some degree distinct and separate from the legacy IT organization. Each of these four capabilities has a strategy. But what this company discovered over time, just as many do, is that these separate pockets of digital strength are really suboptimized if they are not in some fashion tied back together. This becomes especially obvious in breakdowns in the consumer or the customer experience when they try to go from a brand story on one web page to then being able to place an order or even track the inventory on another page. So in this case, we're taking a look at a model. If we go back to the front, middle, back conversation that Amy had, what's happening here is that we're really saying some of these elements sit, and in fact, this was the case, within the business units. Business units continue to own the brand, and therefore they must have a lot of say over the way the brand appears in digital assets. By the same token, the business unit is responsible to develop and manage product around the world. And so digital product has to be connected to those businesses, or we wind up with disconnects between physical product and digital. But in this case, they had also placed digital commerce in the front end as a part of the broader commercial organization. Think of it as global sales. And they had placed the digital backbone in a separate technology group distinct from, again, the legacy IT organization. On the surface, it made sense. The connections among these became the problem to solve. The only way companies that are pursuing these kinds of strategies can create linkage both to the legacy elements of the business and to a larger digital strategy that crosses all four of these components is with some form of network. It cannot be accomplished through traditional org structure. And these networks need to be able to change. In this case, we'll call this pink circle the center. That could be a role. It could be a chief digital officer, but it might not necessarily have to be. Let's look at how the elements get tied together. The first, in this case, is the brand teams. So the lighter pink circle shows a connection to the, let's call it, conventional brand marketing organization in this company. Very important. The digital marketing assets cannot be operated separately from the larger brand stories. But if the digital brand assets are to be connected effectively to the e-commerce work and other elements of the greater digital strategy, they must also be connected to that digital center in some fashion. By the same token, another group, in this case, digital product development, developing digital apps that interact as almost wearable devices with apparel and footwear, have to be connected closely to the traditional product engines, or the wearable software will not work, obviously, with those physical products. But again, if product isn't connected to the brand stories in some fashion in the larger digital strategy, we have a different problem that certainly affects the customer experience at the end of the day. So it also must be linked to that center. Third, we then have e-commerce, an extension of the sales capability and the downstream marketing capability in the regions and in the organization that manages brick and mortar stores. Clearly, the connection to those legacy organizations is critical. But again, if it's not tied to the greater digital community, we have digital brand stories that cannot be executed by the consumer in a simple click through to place an order, and again, to be able to choose where and when to pick up the product or return the product. These are very, very complex integration problems, made more difficult by the fact that in many companies, the digital technology backbone that serves these applications has been separated from the conventional IT group, or maybe is a subset of that group. So linkages there are also important. I think the diagram makes it clear. This is the penultimate integration problem to solve, and there is no amount of org structure that will get us there. We must create these horizontal capabilities. To do that, we're watching companies take a much more disciplined, formal approach to establishing these networks, where in this case, the chief digital officer doesn't necessarily have a reporting line over all of these players, but is a very influential, high-level player reporting directly to the CEO, who oversees a greater digital community, creates integrated strategies across the boundaries, a regular cadence for executing those strategies across these boundaries, clear metrics that are consistent and aligned, pay programs that work to tie the pieces together further, and so forth. In fact, in this case, digital talent, heavily influenced by that player. Of course, our STAR model is the grounding for this integration work. We know structure can serve as an integrator when we design integrating roles, but in this case, process, metrics, reward systems, and the people element play a much stronger role in creating these effective networks. The takeaway, in summary, if we're going to wire these networks together formally, let's go one more page, Amy. We need to be able to create tight connections between these objectives. The center role is a very senior, very influential role that doesn't rely on formal authority to be effective. We utilize operating mechanisms like meeting cadence, decision rights, and a very robust approach to managing talent to make these networks a far more disciplined, active sort of center of gravity in the way that we run the company.
And I really want to underscore what Greg just said around, disciplined and formal, because often in the discussion of speed, agility, nimble, innovation, adaptable, choose the word that you want, or what we're trying to get from our organizations today, there's some sense of, those words go along with sort of a looseness of self-organizing. And in fact, we're talking about complex global organizations. The discipline and formality of this is really important, because what you are creating then are the forums and the conversations in which people can come together and innovate across boundaries and across disciplines. So the design of the organizational model, of then the structures that go into that, and then particularly the lateral connections and the formality around that and the discipline around that, we find has actually become more and more important. And that point around that discipline and formality should not be equated with control or centralization. It should be equated with design. So this really then becomes the work of business and HR and thinking about the design of the organization. And let me just spend a couple of minutes to think about that. But while I do, we'll have a few minutes at the end, before we end. If there are some questions, please just put them in the chat box there, and we'll try to pick them up before we close. So we do a lot of work. Those of you know Kesler, we're a small consulting team of just 15, real passionate about building the field. So in addition to these webinars and books and videos and blogs and such, we do a lot of training, public workshops and internal workshops. And so when our clients ask us about, well, how do we build our capability around organization design internally, we have a few thoughts around that. The leaders are really important. To do this work, we need leaders that think in organizational systems, not just org charts. We need leaders that are willing to be involved in activating the model. So not just let's get it on paper and get an intention, but doing the hard work, which can take months or years, of really getting those teams set up, decision rights, management forums, metrics aligned, the right people in the right place to bring these complex models to life. And that means a lot of hard decisions. We coach our leaders before any sort of projects to be prepared that they will we can have a very participative process for organization design, but it is not a democratic or consensus activity. At the end of the day, leaders need to make decisions. And then going along with that, the patience, though, to learn and adjust. The design process won't get it all right. We have real people sitting in real seats interacting and learning about those patterns of interaction, solving problems, making decisions over time needs to be adjusted. So as HR and OD, internal, external consultants, what we can bring is really this common set of frameworks, tools, methods that the enterprise uses to give these leaders a set of tools and a language to talk about these very abstract concepts together and create alignment. Of course, we need to bring good consulting skills, particularly around the diagnostics. What are the decisions made in the past? given the current situation as well as the future intention, where are there misalignments and what are the biggest things that are out of alignment? Those diagnostics and assessments are so important. And then facilitation skills and coaching skills to help leaders make good decisions. And then so important, and this is why we see a lot of interest in redesigning the HR function and thinking about how the parts work together, because to do this work well, you really need to connect talent, compensation, change management to the OD work that goes on, so that it becomes a systemic and really seamless approach to organizational change. So that brings us to the end. We have many other resources. Those of you not familiar with our work, books, our website, LinkedIn Learning, also YouTube, a set of 12 videos that are open access. So let's open it up for questions, comments, thoughts. One new message here. Sarah, hi, thank you. Let me just get a minute. So just to read this, we might say something like your organizational model slide 11, and let me go back to that. As a start, is reminiscence to the idea of a tech stack. In a recent book, David Weinberger writes of completely new mental models for understanding organizations in the world. One's beyond the industrial and computer age and into computational AI age. Just interested in your thoughts on this and what the next wave of org models we may see drawn from this. Well, I was actually last month in Boston at Harvard Business School for the Organization Design Community Annual Conference, in which the topic was artificial intelligence and organization design. And while it wasn't deep into organization design, most of the presenters were Harvard and MIT professors working more in actually the AI space. It was fascinating to think about exactly this question about what is next. Here's my personal opinion. What I took away from there is we have been on a technology, digital, now AI, machine learning have put us on a path, and that will continue. A lot of attention is being focused on the impacts of automation, robotics, and particularly at that back end around technology, replacing kind of whether in customer service or in the factory, replacing people. What will that do to the nature of work and the future of work? And that seems really important. What was equally interesting, and I think particularly intriguing to me, was how will the possibilities of augmented decision making from big data, AI, machine learning impact some of the work that we don't think of as vulnerable, whether it's marketing decisions or such. And what I took away from this is for a very long time, there will be a sort of dual processing of really, we will get better at using artificial intelligence and machine learning to augment our decision making, but there will be always a really important role of that human component, and particularly humans working together. And as long as we need humans working together, we will need organizations. And these models are really based on not industrial or computer, but they're really based on human behavior. And human behavior, I don't think is going to change significantly or evolve over the next, in our lifetimes. So we really have to always go back to the complexities of organizing human systems, teams, and how do we help people work together. So it makes our work really interesting. I don't think there'll be a significant shift, but it will continue to evolve as it has been, which, as Greg pointed out, creates new business models, new ways of interacting, new roles, and new emphasis. Greg, anything to add to that? There's a couple of.
No, I'm in complete agreement. I think what changes is the nature of the components that sit within the designs that we understand. I do think that, as Jay Galbraith argued years ago, we are going to have to get accustomed to being much more willing to change, to continuously change what those components may be. I think we're going to see a lot more necessity to design organizations that can make adjustments, particularly in the horizontal elements. Which teams come together to get this work done in an effective way? And I think most of our design frameworks continue to be relevant. I am not convinced that hierarchy is going to go away, for example. I think we need to rely much less on hierarchy and rely much more on horizontal organization, but I don't see that going away.
Let's take one more question, and this is a really interesting one, and certainly one that's on our minds. What are your thoughts about applying OD in a holistic way to high growth startups, where sometimes also leaders keep entrepreneurial mindset rather than corporate, the just do it approach? And for sure, what we're talking about here certainly applies to the mature legacy businesses that are changing, working towards solutions, becoming more digital. But what's fascinating is that we have been working more with those sort of high growth startups that are starting to mature. And what's exciting is we're seeing leaders start to recognize the need to think about organization earlier in their maturity curve than perhaps 10 or 20 years ago. Let me turn it over to Greg for some thoughts. You've been in this space a bit.
Well, yeah, I don't have a lot more to add. I'm really impressed. We're working with a $750 million tech startup company right now who have been just enormously successful. I'm so impressed that the senior leadership have recognized that the functional organization that has served them up to this point may not be the right model going forward. And they're very eager to understand, is there an effective way to begin to create something more like a business unit organization? It's interesting because the call to action is accountability. They have really come to discover that the model they have is not accountable. And now that they've taken most of the low-hanging fruit out of the market, this sort of act two for them means being willing to take on a much more accountable set of disciplines and organization model. And so they're very eager to understand, are there smart ways to align customer segments or product segments or even applications or elements of what they call the customer journey that could be used as a form of business unit matrix to cross the existing functions. I think they recognize that even the big guys in their space continue to have strong center-led functional engineering capability, and that doesn't go away. But is there a way to create a more focused set of teams that can come and go from the home room and work on specific applications that would have more of an accountable team orientation to them? And I think we're going to see. I think we're going to see more of that. It's a terrific challenge and problem to solve, again, because we don't see the functions becoming less important. Some of them in particular, the challenge becomes, can we shift the center of gravity away from function decision-making, function strategy, to much more of a customer-centric strategy that really does deliver a customer experience?
Good, thank you. And thanks to all of you who have joined us. And again, if you want more resources, our website, Cornell has a program, videos, but particularly if you're not a member of the organization design community or the organization design forum, either in the US or EODF in Europe, we encourage you to join and become part of the community and all the resources that are available to everyone there. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.